The old Riverside station had been abandoned for over 30 years. The tracks were overgrown with weeds, the platform crumbled into dust, and the single train car left behind had become nothing more than a rusted monument to a forgotten era. But on a cold November evening in 2019, something changed. A faint light flickered inside that forgotten train car. And inside, an old woman named Margaret Chen sat alone, holding a secret that would soon shock an entire community. What she found inside that train would change not only her life, but the lives of dozens of people she had never even met. Stay with me, because this story will break your heart and then put it back together in ways you never expected. Margaret Chen was 73 years old when her world collapsed. For 45 years, she had lived in the same small apartment on Maple Street, raising her 2 children alone after her husband died in a construction accident. She worked double shifts at the textile factory, saved every penny, and made sure her kids had everything they needed. Her son, David, became a software engineer. Her daughter, Lisa, became a nurse. Margaret was proud. She had done her job as a mother. But pride doesn't pay the bills. When Margaret turned 70, the factory closed down. Her pension was barely enough to cover food, let alone the rising rent. She called David first. He lived 3 states away now, in a big house with his wife and 2 children. "David, I need help," she said quietly into the phone. "Mom, we've talked about this," he replied, his voice tired. "You need to downsize. Maybe look into a senior living facility. We're stretched thin here with the kids' college funds." She tried Lisa next. Her daughter lived closer, just 2 hours away. But Lisa had her own problems. "Mom, I'm a single parent working night shifts. I can barely keep my head above water." "You understand, right?" Margaret understood. She always understood. That was her problem. She understood too much and asked for too little. 3 months later, the eviction notice came. Margaret had fallen behind on rent. The new landlord wasn't interested in her 45 years of perfect payment history. He wanted her out in 30 days. Margaret packed her life into 4 cardboard boxes and 1 old suitcase. She called David one more time. He didn't answer. She called Lisa. Voicemail. On the day the sheriff came to remove her, Margaret stood on the sidewalk with her boxes, watching strangers carry out the furniture she'd spent decades collecting. "Where will you go?" the sheriff asked, his voice gentle. Margaret didn't have an answer. The homeless shelter was full. The senior center had a 6-month waiting list. And she refused to sleep on the street like some forgotten piece of trash. That's when she remembered the old Riverside station. As a young woman, she used to take that train to visit her sister in the next town. The station had closed in the 80s, but she'd heard the old train car was still there, abandoned and forgotten. Just like her. Margaret picked up her suitcase and started walking. Before we continue with Margaret's story, I need to ask you something. If stories like this touch your heart, if you believe that every person deserves dignity no matter their age, please hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is dedicated to sharing the stories of those who suffer, those who are forgotten, those who deserve to be heard. Your subscription helps us continue this important work. Now, let's see what Margaret found inside that abandoned train. The walk to Riverside Station took Margaret 2 hours. Her knees ached with every step, and the suitcase felt like it weighed 100 pounds. By the time she reached the old platform, the sun was setting, painting the rusted train car in shades of orange and gold. For a moment, it almost looked beautiful. Then the sun disappeared, and Margaret saw it for what it really was. A metal coffin on wheels. The door was stuck, but Margaret was stronger than she looked. 45 years in a textile factory had given her arms like steel cables. She pushed, pulled, and finally the door screeched open, revealing the dark interior. The smell hit her first. Mold, rust, and something else. Something old and sad, like the train itself was mourning its abandonment. Margaret stepped inside. The seats were torn, springs poking through the fabric like broken bones. The windows were so filthy she could barely see through them. Graffiti covered the walls. But it was shelter. It was private. And most importantly, it was free. Margaret set down her suitcase and sat on one of the broken seats. For the first time in 3 months, she let herself cry. She cried for her lost home. She cried for her children who had become strangers. She cried for her husband, gone 30 years but missed every single day. And she cried for herself, for the old woman she'd become, invisible and unwanted in a world that had no use for her anymore. When the tears finally stopped, Margaret wiped her face and got to work. She'd been poor before. She knew how to survive. She used an old blanket from her suitcase to wipe down one section of a seat. She arranged her boxes to create a small living space. She opened a can of soup and ate it cold because she had no way to heat it. And when night fell completely, she lay down on the hard seat and pulled her coat over herself like a blanket. The train was cold. The seat was uncomfortable. Strange sounds echoed through the metal walls. But Margaret had survived worse. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow she would figure out what to do next. Tomorrow she would make a plan. But tomorrow never comes the way we expect it to. Margaret woke up to sunlight streaming through the dirty windows. Her back screamed in pain from sleeping on the broken seat. She was 73 years old, and her body reminded her of that fact every single morning. She sat up slowly, rubbing her neck, and looked around her new home in the daylight. That's when she noticed something she'd missed the night before. At the far end of the train car, there was a door. Not the exit door. Another door. A door to what must have been the conductor's cabin or a storage compartment. Margaret stood up, her knees cracking like dry wood, and walked toward it. The door was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. Margaret pulled a screwdriver from her suitcase. Her husband had taught her basic repairs 50 years ago. Some skills you never forget. The lock broke on the third try. The door swung open with a groan that sounded almost human. And Margaret froze. The small compartment was filled with boxes. Not just a few boxes. Dozens of them, stacked from floor to ceiling. And they looked old. Really old. Margaret's heart started beating faster. She pulled out her phone. The battery was at 15%, but she needed the flashlight. She clicked it on and stepped inside. The first box she opened contained letters. Hundreds of letters, tied together with faded ribbon. Margaret picked up one bundle and carefully untied it. The paper was yellow and brittle. She opened the first letter and began to read. "My dearest James," it began. "I hope this letter finds you well. The war has taken so much from us, but it cannot take my love for you." Margaret's hands trembled. These were love letters from World War II. She opened another box. More letters. And another. Photographs. And another. Military medals. And another. Personal belongings. Watches. Rings. Diaries. The compartment wasn't just a storage room. It was a time capsule. A museum of forgotten lives. Margaret spent the entire day going through the boxes. Each one told a story. Each one held a life. There was a diary from a young woman named Eleanor who had worked as a nurse during the war. There were letters from a soldier named Thomas who had written to his mother every week, promising he would come home safely. He never did. The last letter was from his commanding officer, informing his mother of his death. There were engagement rings that had never been worn. Wedding photos that had never been displayed. Baby shoes that had never been outgrown. Every box was a tragedy. Every item was a memory that someone had left behind and never retrieved. And as Margaret sat there, surrounded by these forgotten lives, something shifted inside her. She wasn't the only person who had ever felt abandoned. She wasn't the only person who had ever been forgotten. These people, these lives, they had all been left behind too. Their stories had been sealed in this train car for decades, waiting for someone to find them, waiting for someone to care. And Margaret realized something profound. Maybe she hadn't been forced to live in this train by accident. Maybe she had been brought here for a reason. What Margaret decided to do next will absolutely shock you. But before we continue, if you're feeling emotional right now, if this story is touching something deep inside you, I want you to do something. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me what you think Margaret should do with this discovery. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because stories like this are what this channel is all about. The stories of those who suffer. The stories that need to be told. Now, let's see how Margaret's discovery changed everything. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Her mind was racing with possibilities. These boxes contained the personal effects of people who had used this train station decades ago. But why were they here? Why had they been abandoned? Margaret found her answer in a water-damaged logbook at the bottom of one of the boxes. The logbook belonged to the station master from 1952. In faded ink, he had documented a tragic incident. On November 15, 1952, a passenger train had derailed 3 miles from Riverside Station. 47 people had died. The survivors' belongings, along with the personal effects of those who had died, had been brought to the station. Families were supposed to claim them, but many never did. Some families had lost everyone in the crash. Others couldn't afford to travel to claim the items. And some just wanted to forget. Over the years, the station master had kept the boxes, hoping someone would claim them. But nobody came. When the station closed in 1983, the boxes were sealed in the conductor's compartment and forgotten. Until now. Until Margaret. Margaret made a decision that night. She would find the families. She would return these belongings to the descendants of the people who had left them behind. It would give her a purpose. It would give these forgotten lives meaning. And maybe, just maybe, it would give her own life meaning too. The next morning, Margaret walked 2 miles to the public library. She had $10 to her name. She used 5 of it to print copies of some of the letters and photographs. Then she sat at one of the public computers and began her research. She had no experience with genealogy. She barely knew how to use the internet. But Margaret had something more valuable than technical skills. She had determination. She started with the easiest cases. Letters that had full names and addresses. She searched for obituaries, census records, phone directories. One by one, she began to piece together family trees. It was slow work, frustrating work. Many of the families had moved away or died out, but some leads turned up results. After 2 weeks of research, Margaret found her first match. A woman named Eleanor Rosewood had left behind a diary and a collection of nursing medals. Margaret traced her family tree and found that Eleanor had a granddaughter named Patricia living in the same state, just 60 miles away. Margaret had no car, no money for gas, but she had a bus pass that the county had given her when she was evicted. She packed Eleanor's belongings carefully in her suitcase and took the bus. Patricia was 58 years old and had never known much about her grandmother. Eleanor had died when Patricia was just a baby. All she had were a few photographs and stories her father had told her. When Margaret showed up at her door with Eleanor's diary and medals, Patricia broke down crying. "My grandmother was a hero," she kept saying, reading through the diary entries about saving soldiers' lives during the war. "I never knew. I never knew." Patricia insisted on driving Margaret back to the train station. When she saw where Margaret was living, she was horrified. "You can't stay here," she said. But Margaret was firm. "I'm fine," she said. "I have work to do." Patricia left, but not before pressing $200 into Margaret's hand. "For your research," she said. "For my grandmother." Margaret had found her first family, but there were 46 more boxes to go. Can you imagine the determination of this woman? 73 years old, living in an abandoned train, dedicating her life to returning forgotten belongings to their rightful owners. This is what true human compassion looks like. If this story is inspiring you, if you want to see more stories about real human goodness in a world that often feels cold, you need to be subscribed to this channel. Hit that button right now. Turn on the bell. And stay with me, because Margaret's story is about to take a turn that nobody saw coming. Over the next 3 months, Margaret found 12 more families. Each reunion was emotional. Each one reminded Margaret why she was doing this. A 70-year-old man received his father's war medals and broke down crying. A middle-aged woman received love letters her grandparents had written to each other and learned the story of how they met. A young man received his great-uncle's pocket watch and realized he had been named after him. But Margaret's work was starting to take a toll. The train was freezing now that winter had arrived. Her food supply was running low. The $200 from Patricia was gone, spent on bus fare and printing costs. Margaret was hungry, cold, and exhausted. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. One day, as Margaret was researching at the library, a young journalist named Amy Chen noticed her. Amy had been working on a story about the old train station and its history. She saw this elderly woman, clearly homeless, spending hours on the computer, surrounded by old photographs and documents. Curiosity got the better of her. "Excuse me," Amy said gently. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Margaret looked up, surprised. She wasn't used to people talking to her anymore. She had become invisible. But Amy's eyes were kind. And Margaret was so tired of being alone. So she told Amy everything. The eviction. The train. The boxes. The families. Amy listened, her eyes growing wider with each detail. "Can I write about this?" Amy asked when Margaret finished. "Can I tell your story?" Margaret hesitated. She didn't want attention. She didn't want pity. But Amy made a good point. If people knew what Margaret was doing, they could help. More families could be found. More belongings could be returned. So Margaret agreed. Amy's article ran in the local newspaper 3 days later. The headline read, "Homeless Woman Lives in Abandoned Train, Dedicates Life to Returning Lost Belongings to Crash Victims' Families." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The newspaper's phone lines were flooded. People wanted to help. They wanted to donate. They wanted to meet Margaret. Within a week, Margaret's story had gone viral. Local news stations picked it up. Then national news. Then international news. Margaret Chen, the 73-year-old woman living in an abandoned train, became a symbol of selflessness and determination. Donations poured in. People sent money, supplies, warm clothes, food. A local genealogy society volunteered to help with the research. A historian from the State University offered to document the entire project. But the most surprising response came from Margaret's children. David saw his mother's story on the news at his office in California. He stared at the screen, watching his mother be interviewed in front of the rusted train car, and felt shame wash over him like ice water. His mother was homeless. His mother was living in a train. And he had ignored her calls. He booked a flight immediately. Lisa saw the article shared on Facebook. Her coworker had posted it with the caption, "This is what true compassion looks like." Lisa clicked on the link, saw her mother's face, and felt her heart shatter. She called in sick to work, got in her car, and drove straight to Riverside Station. David arrived first. He stood on the old platform, staring at the train car where his mother lived, and felt like the worst son in the world. He had a 6-bedroom house. His mother had a broken train seat. He knocked on the train door, unsure of what to say. The door opened, and Margaret stood there, looking smaller and older than he remembered. "Mom," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Margaret didn't speak at first. She just looked at her son, the boy she had raised, the man she barely knew anymore. Then she stepped aside and let him in. David looked around the train car. It was cleaner than he expected. Margaret had used donated supplies to make it almost livable. There were blankets, a small camping stove, boxes of food. But it was still a train car. It was still heartbreaking. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 4 months, Margaret said quietly. 4 months. For months his mother had been homeless, and he hadn't known. Hadn't cared enough to find out. David sat down on one of the seats and put his head in his hands. "Come home with me," he said. "Please. Come to California. You can live with us. We have space." But Margaret shook her head. "I can't leave. Not yet. I have work to finish." She showed him the boxes. She told him about the family she'd found. She explained her mission. And David understood. His mother had always been like this. Always putting others first. Always finding purpose in helping people. It was who she was. It was why he had survived childhood after his father died. It was why he had succeeded in life. "If you won't come with me," David said, "then I'll help you here. I can take time off work. I can use my tech skills to help with research. We'll finish this together." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. Lisa arrived that evening. She burst into the train car, saw her mother and brother sitting together surrounded by boxes, and collapsed in sobs. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry." Margaret held her daughter while she cried. "There's nothing to forgive," Margaret said softly. But there was. They both knew it. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret's children worked alongside her. David created a database to organize all the information they had gathered. He built a website where families could search for their relatives' belongings. Lisa used her medical connections to set up health checks for Margaret and to connect her with proper housing resources. But Margaret refused to leave the train until the work was done. The three of them worked 12-hour days. With David's technical skills and Lisa's organizational abilities, the research went faster. They found 30 more families in those 2 weeks. Each reunion was filmed by Amy, the journalist who had started it all. The story continued to grow. A filmmaker reached out about making a documentary. A book publisher wanted to tell Margaret's story. But Margaret wasn't interested in fame. She just wanted to finish what she started. We're almost at the end of Margaret's incredible journey, but I need to pause here for a moment. If this story has moved you, if you felt anger at how Margaret was treated, sadness at her situation, or joy at her reunion with her children, I want you to understand something. Stories like this are happening every single day. Elderly people are being forgotten, abandoned, left to survive on their own. This channel exists to shine a light on these stories, to remind us all of our shared humanity, to inspire us to do better. If you believe in this mission, subscribe right now. And please share this video. You never know who needs to hear this message. Now, let's see how Margaret's story ends. It took 6 months in total, but Margaret, with the help of her children, volunteers, and the community, managed to trace and return belongings from 45 of the 46 boxes. Each reunion was documented. Each story was preserved. The forgotten victims of the 1952 crash were finally remembered. Their families finally had closure. But there was one box left. The last box. And it was the most mysterious of all. It contained no letters, no photographs, no identification. Just a gold wedding ring, a man's watch, and a single train ticket dated November 15, 1952. The ticket was for a passenger named J. Chen. Margaret stared at that name for a long time. Chen. Her married name. But it couldn't be. Could it? She had married Thomas Chen in 1975. He had died in 1989. This ticket was from 1952. It was impossible. But Margaret couldn't let it go. She dove into research with a desperation she hadn't felt before. She discovered that Thomas Chen had an uncle named James Chen. James had died in 1952 at the age of 34. Cause of death: train accident. Margaret's hands shook as she realized the truth. The crash that had created these boxes of forgotten belongings had killed her husband's uncle, the man whose belongings had never been claimed. The man whose family had been too devastated to retrieve his personal effects. Margaret had spent 6 months returning belongings to strangers. But the last box, the last story, was her own family's story. She held James Chen's wedding ring in her palm and thought about the strange path that had led her here. She had been evicted, abandoned, forced to live in a train. And she had found her husband's uncle's belongings waiting for her, as if the universe had planned this all along. Margaret took the ring, the watch, and the ticket to her husband's grave. She knelt beside the headstone and placed the items there. "Your uncle's belongings," she whispered. "I found them. I brought them home." And she finally understood. She hadn't been abandoned. She had been guided. Her suffering had led her to this place, to this purpose, to this redemption. The documentary about Margaret's story premiered at a film festival and won 3 awards. The book became a bestseller. But more importantly, Margaret's story inspired real change. The city of Riverside voted to restore the old train station and turn it into a memorial and museum for the 1952 crash victims. Margaret was asked to be the curator. A local non-profit organization built a small apartment for Margaret on the museum grounds. It was small but comfortable, warm, safe, and filled with the photographs and letters she had spent months researching. Margaret finally had a home again. But more than that, she had a purpose. David moved his family closer, taking a remote position so he could spend more time with his mother. Lisa visited every weekend. Margaret's grandchildren, who had barely known her before, now volunteered at the museum, learning about history and compassion from their grandmother's example. The museum opened on November 15, 2020, exactly 68 years after the crash. Hundreds of people attended. Families who had received their relatives' belongings came to thank Margaret in person. The mayor gave a speech about service and sacrifice. But the most powerful moment came when Margaret stood in front of the crowd and spoke. "I was 73 years old when I lost everything," she said, her voice steady and strong. "I thought my life was over. I thought I had no value anymore. But sometimes our greatest purpose comes from our deepest pain. Sometimes we have to lose everything to find what really matters. I didn't find those boxes by accident. I found them because I was meant to. And every single one of you standing here today, every family that got to hold their loved ones' belongings again, you were all meant to be found too." The crowd erupted in applause. Margaret stood there, surrounded by the people whose lives she had touched, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt seen. She felt valued. She felt loved. The old woman who had been forced to live in an abandoned train had become a hero. The forgotten woman had made sure others would never be forgotten. Margaret Chen is 80 years old now. She still works at the museum 4 days a week. She still helps families research their genealogy. And she still lives in the small apartment on the museum grounds. But she's not alone anymore. Her children visit regularly. Her grandchildren call her every week. And people from all over the world come to the Riverside Station Museum to hear her story and to learn about the power of compassion. The abandoned train car is still there, preserved as part of the museum. Margaret sometimes goes inside and sits on the same broken seat where she spent her first night. She remembers the fear, the loneliness, the desperation, but she also remembers what she found. Not just the boxes of forgotten belongings, but her own purpose, her own strength, her own value. Margaret's story reminds us that it's never too late to find meaning, that suffering can lead to purpose, that being forgotten doesn't mean you're not important, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually the beginning of our greatest achievements. Old woman was forced to live in abandoned train, the headlines had said. What she found inside changed her life forever. But it didn't just change Margaret's life. It changed the lives of hundreds of people. And if you're watching this right now, maybe it's changing yours too. Thank you for staying with me through Margaret's entire journey. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think differently about the elderly people in your own life, if it inspired you to reach out to someone you've been neglecting, then my job here is done. But I need your help to continue sharing stories like this. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell. Like this video. And most importantly, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Leave a comment below telling me what Margaret's story meant to you. And remember, everyone has a story. Everyone has value. No matter how old they are. No matter how forgotten they seem. Thank you for being part of this community. Until next time, remember the stories of those who suffer, because they're the ones that remind us what it means to be human.